The Institute for Criminal Policy Research at Birkbeck has revealed an alarming and rapid recent increase in the number of people imprisoned globally, a figure currently standing at well over 10.5 million. The research shows that it's not primarily a country's crime rate that dictates how many people are in prison. There's a more complex set of causes behind how many prisoners a country has and who they imprison. Social, economic, and political factors play a bigger part than we may imagine. One thing is becoming clear: when prisons can't keep pace with the ever greater demands placed on them by longer sentences and quicker recourse to custody, they will be less able to reform or rehabilitate and more likely to cause further damage. The ICPR research indicates that the overcrowded, inhumane prison systems we see across much of the globe are causing disproportionate harm to poor and marginalised people in all societies. This limits their capacity to deal effectively with those relatively few prisoners who pose serious risks.
So we might well ask, do prisons do more harm than good? And are there solutions for the future? And to debate that question, we have invited a panel of experts from different jurisdictions to share their insight. In the studio, we have Marian Vollen, Director General of the Norwegian Correctional Services; Dan Lombardo, Community Representative from the Not-for-Profit Volunteers of America; Mark Johnson, founder of the voluntary organization User Voice; and Peter Dawson, Director, Prison Reform Trust. I spent 15 months in Brixton Prison, where I experienced the good, the bad, and the ugly of the criminal justice system. I saw some people who were really let down, but I became involved with the Prison Radio Association as a broadcaster, a great opportunity to move on with my life. But I was one of the lucky ones, because rates of rearrest, reconviction, and re-imprisonment are so high in so many jurisdictions. Marianne, what's Norway's answer to this?
The most important is that the prisoner is still a citizen. The penalty is the deprivation or restriction of liberty, not other rights. To help us with that, our guiding star is the principle of normality. We try to make a routine in the prison, which resembles as much as possible life outside the walls.
Dan, figures indicate that the United States has the world's second highest prison population rate behind the Seychelles. It must have been a massive cost to the public purse, but how is the United States tackling this?
Well, they're not, if you really want to know the truth. Frankly, I thought we were number one because of the number of people that we do have behind the walls. For us, the frustrating part is anything that the United States does has to be a war. So it started with the war on drugs. Once the war on drugs started, along with mandatory minimums, so you ended up incarcerating more folks very quickly in systems that are overcrowded, that have caused a lot of very unique problems in communities, as well as very few options to do that decompression as they come back into the community. So the failure rate in the United States is very high.
Peter Dawson, I'm quite interested. How does the UK compare with this?
Well, I feel like we've got the worst of both worlds. We've got a philosophy like the Norwegian philosophy, but the way we use imprisonment makes it virtually impossible to deliver on those ambitions. So for as long as anyone can remember in the UK, 25% of prisoners have been living in accommodation that was designed for fewer people, 2 people in a cell designed for 1. Now, in those circumstances, you're doomed not to realise the ambitions that you've got for your system.
Mark, you would have seen some of these problems.
What you've got to realise is where people that actually get incarcerated come from in the first place. And that is, there's a high proportion of people without families, or if they have, their families are dysfunctional, etc. So sometimes you can't rely even on the actual family that's outside. So how we work is in a peer approach way of saying that actually we have similar problems and actually what can we do to address. There might be some constraints over 2 people that's actually in a cell that was made for 1 person, or there might be a drug intervention program that actually is not very good. So what can we do together to actually make that better and make our experiences better and our chances of re-entry into society better as well?
In Australia, engagement with the non-government and private sector has brought some success. Let's hear from Peter Severin in Sydney.
For me, prisons are very much at the centre of a human service in our community. We're dealing with the whole person. We're not just dealing with a particular aspect of a person in the context, for example, of mental health or drug and alcohol problems or housing. We're dealing with every aspect there is, particularly in the reintegration of offenders back into the community. So we can't be out of sight, out of mind. We are not at the end of the conveyor belt. We need to make sure that through strong engagement with the non-government sector, through engagement with the private sector and other government agencies, we structure a path for an offender to return back into the community.
Marianne, in Norway, you have services provided by the community, your import model. How is that working?
The prison service, we will motivate the prisoners, that's what we are good at. But delivering health care, employment care, library services, etc., that will be other bodies that are good at that. So they come in and they deliver their services in our facilities.
In the United States, how effective are organizations like the Volunteers of America? How successful have they been?
Well, we've been doing prisoner intervention services since 1896. The organization's co-founder, a woman by the name of Maud Booth, created the first series of halfway houses in the U.S. She was also a staunch advocate for prisoners because back in the day there was the ball and chain and the striped uniform and marching in lockstep and all of those things. If she were alive today, she'd be spinning in the United States because of the kinds of things that we're doing. The number of prisons that there are, the number of prisons that generate more problems rather than solve them. How can you put folks into an environment, that's surrounded by folks that think very, very criminally, and then expect them, when you open the doors and send them out saying, go out and sin no more, that you expect them to function successfully in society. If you do not have a decompression or a reintegration process, it can't work. Employment's key, housing's key. If you find somebody, if you get them a job and you get them a clean, safe place to stay, it'd be amazing how successful they could be.
I agree, Dan. From my experience, I've seen individuals that came into prison perhaps not, being literate at all, and leaving prison being able to read. It definitely does a lot for one's confidence.
Great.
Let's hear from Peter Severin again on how non-government agencies manage the transition of released inmates in New South Wales.
So engaging with the non-government sector to particularly focus on those 3 months once somebody gets out in the context of transitional support, housing, work, any kind of connection to other services that might need to be offered, such as drug and alcohol services or mental health services, is of critical importance. That is where the non-government sector, particularly here in Australia, is really strong. And that's where we strategically engage with the non-government sector to facilitate those transitional models. And we do that in a quite unique way, in that we incentivize contracts for the non-government sector and make them actually a payment by results type, outcome-focused contractual framework, meaning there is an incentive for the non-government sector to do particularly well.
Dan, what is the general public opinion in the US?
Well, again, if you take a look at the various different jurisdictions that you're dealing with, some are far more conservative than others. But we've testified in front of legislative hearing about no-frills prisons. And the first question we ask is, who's going to work there? It's just madness. For us, our society is a no-deposit, no-return society. And so what they're expecting is that once a person is incarcerated, fine, they're done. You don't have to worry about them anymore. 95% of them come home. The question that has to be asked and must be asked over and over is, how do you want them to come back? And if you don't do that, and if you don't, as a society, begin to take a look at those issues and the reasons why you're sending so many to prison, especially for minority communities. If you're doing that, if you're not asking those questions, that's what happens, is you create a problem that really just is going to grow and cost you more and more money.
Can I tell you a bit of a story? Most people who go to prison, certainly in the UK, come from poor communities. Every now and again, a nice middle-class person gets sent to prison, and they are outraged, they are scandalised by the treatment that they receive. Those are the people who also read the newspapers that are scandalised by prisons. But real experience, real contact changes people's minds overnight.
there is a general concept that most convicted people, they will be someone's neighbor in the future. And I often refer to my staff as my agents of change. I think staff is key. But what I experience that even bus drivers, taxi drivers are my agents of change, because they have in many ways the same concept. They think that we should really work hard with the convicts while they are with us, with the ambition that they can be good law-abiding neighbors.
I'm quite interested in, from a Norwegian perspective, is that right across your risk levels, from maximum to like low risk?
Where we have the biggest discussions, if we have some really serious offenses. And of course, we are not naive. We will not treat all prisoners the same way. We have had terrible terrorist attack some years ago, 6 years ago, and of course there will be a different regime with a convict like that, but the vast majority will come back to some community, and I think it's so important to always bear that in mind.
The biggest issue for a person, somebody exits prison, is the life sentence that anybody gets through coming into contact with criminal justice, and that's the stigma. Yeah, we stigmatise people on release. So you could offer any program that you want. Yeah, and until we address that, having to disclose a criminal conviction for the rest of your life, no matter what you've done, we won't get any further.
I agree with that.
Yeah,
because I'll tell you, that's the biggest issue in the U.S. too. It's called collateral sanctions, okay? Yeah. It's the punishment that keeps on giving. It's to the point where if you have a felony drug conviction, you virtually cannot get a job. It's impossible for you. Even if you learned a skill in the prison system, you couldn't get the license to implement that skill in the community. It's ridiculous.
Now, Mark, User Voice, your charity organization, encourages collaboration between service providers and service users. How has this worked in prisons and with the probation service?
The long-term solution is putting people like me and you in charge of our own lives so we won't be reconvicted again. And you do that by taking a risk around working very fairly and equally with dignity and respect. Yeah, and simply by asking somebody what they think about something is an actual intervention in itself. And so we have a model that basically goes into prison with ex-offenders because the biggest barrier is trust. And when you've got people in positions of extreme power over your life, quite rightly so, that you don't trust. And so we work with ex-offenders, giving opportunities to actually now work back in prison as key holders as well. So we work around the wings, do a deep engagement, and then plug them in with senior management, i.e. the governor, and do the deep engagement. On average, about 75–80% of each prison we work in will engage with, and then start to come up with solutions.
Well, I really endorse what Mark is saying, and I used to be a prison governor, a warden, a director, and I can remember the look on my staff's faces when I said we need to hand over some power to prisoners. It's a change in the balance of power that you need to make it work. Most people stop committing crime in their late 20s. Now, if we get in the way of that, if we keep people in prison for too long and we destroy their hope and we destroy their faith in the system, if we treat them unjustly, we postpone that moment perhaps indefinitely.
Or you're spending billions and billions and billions of dollars on a system that doesn't work. And yet you keep spending billions and billions and billions of dollars on it. Yeah. For us, the logic of it just totally escapes me. Instead of there being sort of like a taxpayer revolt on what the outcomes are and the incredible losses that they're facing dollar-wise as a result of the inadequacy of the system, rather than addressing that, you have more and more tough on crime policies. You have more and more rhetoric. Everybody's looking for the magic bullet or the quick fix, and it just doesn't happen that way. This is a very prolonged and deliberate strategy that can affect the reduction of the prison population only if the community supports and the transitions are there.
Now, Dan, I want to pick up on a point. How much has the work you do saved the public purse? And also, how does cuts to funding affect what you do?
First part is there's been a 37% reduction in the New Jersey State prison system, and that's as a result of the investment in community-based programming. How it started was The largest sender to the Department of Corrections was parole. Most of the offenses for parole, 85% of them, were what they call technical violations. Dirty urines, failure to maintain employment, failure to maintain housing, failure to report, stuff like that, no new crimes. So we figured if you could cut off that feeder system, what you would do is you would save a tremendous amount of money in the prison system, and then you could take those dollars and you could invest them in community-based programs to keep folks out of prison. So as a reduction of the 37% reduction, is what you're seeing is you're seeing an investment that has now long-term implications. 15 years ago, the Department of Corrections budget was $1.3 billion. This year, it's $890 million. So you've saved almost half a billion dollars in just doing prudent, creative management kinds of issues with the prison population.
So to conclude, prisons, more harm than good. Marianne.
Hilary, that is a complex question, because we will need prisons in our foreseeable future. The thing is that when we know it has a lot of harmful effects, we need to look for alternatives. We need to look for other ways of serving a sentence. For instance, back home with an electronic monitoring system, that is one way of doing it. The other thing is that if we still are to have prisons, and I believe that we will have that, we need to invest in staff and quality, so we really make the most of it while the prisoners are there.
For us, I would like to see more of those dollars that are being invested in the prison system into two very interesting categories. One is community-based programs, and the second one is community reinvestment. Let's invest where the communities, where the people come from. You might find that it's a tremendous deterrent to future crime and future issues.
Highest deaths, highest attempted suicide rates, drug addiction epidemic in prison, that half the number of staff that we had 7 years ago. It's, you know, even when I was in prison way back when, there was more support than there actually is now.
Prison always does harm. Very occasionally, it can do some good. But we abolished the death penalty in the UK in the 1950s, and last year 350 people didn't even survive their prison sentence. It's a terrible thing that we're doing.
Thank you for joining us today. And thank you to Peter Severin in New South Wales.